On a busy Tuesday morning in downtown Boston, Sarah Mbeki drove her black Mercedes carefully through the streets. The autumn sun made the tall buildings shine, and she checked her watch, making sure she was on time for her important meeting. Sarah had only been in Boston for 3 days, but she already liked the city's energy and friendly people. Officer Mike Peterson sat in his police car at the intersection of Washington and State Street. He had been working this corner for 5 years, and today seemed like any other normal day. His coffee was getting cold in the cup holder, and he hadn't given out a single ticket all morning. Then he saw the black Mercedes approach the traffic light. The light turned yellow, and from Officer Peterson's view, it seemed the car went through when the light was red. He turned on his police lights and pulled out into traffic, following the Mercedes. Sarah noticed the flashing lights in her mirror and carefully pulled over to the side of the road, making sure not to block any traffic. Officer Peterson walked up to the car, his hand resting on his belt like he always did. He saw a well-dressed black woman sitting behind the wheel, looking at him calmly through the window. Sarah rolled down her window and smiled politely. "License and registration, please," Officer Peterson said, his voice firm but not friendly. He noticed her expensive clothes and the way she carried herself with confidence. Something about her calm manner made him feel uncomfortable, though he couldn't explain why. "Of course, officer," Sarah replied in her clear, accented English. She reached for her purse slowly and carefully. "May I ask why you stopped me?" Officer Peterson's face hardened slightly. "You ran a red light back there at the intersection." Sarah's eyebrows went up in surprise. "I'm quite certain the light was yellow when I went through, officer. I always drive very carefully." "Ma'am, I saw what I saw," Officer Peterson said, his voice getting harder. "The light was red. Now, I need to see your license and registration." Sarah handed him her documents, still keeping her calm expression. Officer Peterson looked at them with a frown, noting her foreign license. "This isn't a U.S. driver's license," he said. "No, it isn't," Sarah agreed. "I have international driving permissions. You'll find those documents there as well." Officer Peterson shuffled through the papers, his frown getting deeper. He didn't like her tone, though Sarah was speaking politely. Something about the way she seemed so sure of herself bothered him. "Step out of the car, please." Sarah sighed quietly, but did as he asked. She stood straight in her navy blue business suit, her high heels clicking on the pavement. Other cars drove by slowly, their drivers watching the scene with interest. "I'm going to write you a ticket for running the red light," Officer Peterson announced, pulling out his ticket book. "And I want you to come to court this morning to explain these foreign documents. This needs to be handled properly." "Officer, I don't believe that's necessary," Sarah began, but Peterson cut her off. "Ma'am, your attitude isn't helping here," he said sharply. "You can explain everything to Judge Harrison. He's good at dealing with difficult cases." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, officer. I will appear in court, though I must tell you—" "Save it for the judge," Peterson interrupted, writing the ticket quickly. "Court starts at 9:30. Don't be late." He handed her the ticket and walked back to his police car without another word. Sarah watched him drive away, then looked at the ticket in her hand. She took out her phone and made a quick call. "Hello, Thomas?" "Yes, I'm afraid I'll be a bit delayed for the morning meeting." "No, nothing serious, just a small misunderstanding with local law enforcement." "Yes, I'll handle it." She paused, listening. No need to call anyone yet. Let's see how this plays out first." Sarah got back in her car, checked her mirrors, and pulled carefully back into traffic. As she drove toward the courthouse, she thought about what had just happened. In her 10 years of diplomatic service, she had seen this kind of situation many times before. She wasn't angry, just disappointed that even here, in one of America's most educated cities, some things hadn't changed. The courthouse wasn't far away, and she still had time before the hearing. Sarah parked her car and walked up the stone steps, her head held high. She had learned long ago that dignity was the best response to prejudice. Now she wondered what Judge Harrison would be like, and if he would see past his officer's obvious bias. Judge Samuel Harrison's courtroom was already busy when Sarah Mbeki walked in. The room smelled of old wood and cleaning supplies, and the morning sunlight came through tall windows, making patterns on the wooden benches. Sarah found a seat in the back row, watching as other people went before the judge. Judge Harrison sat high up on his bench, looking down at everyone through his reading glasses. He was in his early 60s, with gray hair and a face that showed he rarely smiled. He had been a judge for 30 years, and most people in the courthouse knew him as a strict man who didn't like to waste time. Case number 247, Sarah Mbeki. The court clerk called out. Traffic violation, running a red light. Sarah stood up gracefully and walked to the front of the courtroom. Officer Peterson was already there, standing straight with his hands behind his back. Judge Harrison looked down at the papers on his desk, then at Sarah. Ms. Mbeki, Judge Harrison said, pronouncing her name wrong. Officer Peterson says you ran a red light this morning and were uncooperative during the stop. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly, and it's pronounced Mbeki. Her voice was clear and confident, which seemed to irritate the judge. Judge Harrison frowned. Officer Peterson, please tell the court what happened. Officer Peterson stepped forward. Your Honor, at approximately 8:45 this morning, I observed the defendant's vehicle running a red light at Washington and State Street. When I pulled her over, she was argumentative and questioned my judgment. She also presented foreign documentation that needs verification. Sarah noticed how Officer Peterson made her sound difficult when she had only asked simple questions. She waited patiently for her turn to speak. Ms. Mbeki, Judge Harrison said, still using the wrong pronunciation, do you have anything to say in your defense? Yes, Your Honor, Sarah began. The light was yellow when I entered the intersection. As for my documents, are you saying Officer Peterson is lying? Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice getting sharp. No, Your Honor, Sarah replied. I'm simply stating what I observed, and regarding my documentation. Ms. Mbeki, Judge Harrison cut her off again. I've been doing this job for 30 years. Every day, people come in here telling me the light was yellow, not red. Every day, people question our officer's judgment. I don't have time for this. The other people in the courtroom watched quietly. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed interested in how this would play out. Your Honor. Sarah tried again, if you would just look at my credentials. I've heard enough, Judge Harrison said loudly. Based on Officer Peterson's testimony and your attitude in this courtroom, I'm finding you guilty of running a red light. The fine is $200. Sarah stayed calm, though her eyes showed disappointment. Your Honor, before you make your final decision, make that $300 for continuing to argue, Judge Harrison said, his face getting red. Would you like to try for $400? The courtroom was completely silent now. Everyone was watching Sarah, who stood straight and dignified despite the judge's harsh tone. No, Your Honor, she said quietly, but I really must inform you. $400 it is, Judge Harrison declared, banging his gavel. And if you say one more word, I'll hold you in contempt of court. Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out a diplomatic passport and official papers. She placed them on the clerk's desk without saying anything. The clerk looked at the documents, and her eyes went wide. Your Honor. The clerk said nervously, you might want to see these. What is it now? Judge Harrison asked impatiently, taking the papers. As he read them, the color drained from his face. The documents showed that Sarah Mbeki was the deputy ambassador from Kenya to the United Nations. She had full diplomatic immunity, and more importantly, she was in Boston to lead trade negotiations worth millions of dollars between several African nations and the United States. Judge Harrison looked up from the papers to find Sarah watching him calmly. The whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The morning had suddenly become much more interesting than anyone had expected. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Harrison stared at Sarah's diplomatic papers. His hands were shaking slightly as he read them again, hoping he had made a mistake. But there was no mistake. The woman he had just fined $400 was one of the most important diplomats from Kenya. Sarah stood quietly, her hands folded in front of her. She could see the judge's face changing color, first white, then red, then almost purple. Behind her, the people in the courtroom whispered to each other. Officer Peterson shifted uncomfortably from one foot to the other. Your Honor, the court clerk whispered, the ambassador's office is on line 1. They're asking about Deputy Ambassador Mbeki. Judge Harrison loosened his collar. Sweat appeared on his forehead as he realized how big a mistake he had made. This wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. This was about international relations. I, Judge Harrison cleared his throat. The court will take a 15-minute recess. He banged his gavel and quickly stood up. Actually, Your Honor. Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. I believe we should finish this now. I have a meeting at the United Nations office in 1 hour. The judge slowly sat back down. The whole courtroom watched as Sarah walked closer to his bench. She moved with grace and confidence, like someone used to dealing with difficult situations. Deputy Ambassador Mbeki, Judge Harrison said, finally pronouncing her name correctly, I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. Is that what we're calling it? Sarah asked quietly. Her voice wasn't angry, but her words made Judge Harrison sink lower in his chair. A misunderstanding is when someone gets the time wrong for a meeting. This was something quite different, wasn't it? Two reporters who had been in the courtroom for another case were now writing quickly in their notebooks. They knew this was going to be a big story. I admit I acted hastily, Judge Harrison said, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. Of course, all fines are dismissed, and if there's anything else I can do. Yes, there is, Sarah said. She turned to face the whole courtroom. What happened here today is not just about me. It's about how quick we are to judge people based on how they look or sound. I wonder how many others have stood in this courtroom and weren't treated fairly because they didn't have a diplomatic passport to protect them. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Some people nodded their heads, while others looked at the floor. Officer Peterson stared straight ahead, his face red. Deputy Ambassador, Judge Harrison started, but Sarah held up her hand. I'm not finished, she said firmly. I came to Boston to negotiate trade deals that would help both our countries. But perhaps there's something more important we need to discuss first. How can we talk about international cooperation when we can't even treat each other with basic respect in our own courtrooms? A woman in the back of the courtroom started clapping. Soon, others joined in. Judge Harrison banged his gavel for order, but the damage was done. Everyone had seen how quickly he had judged Sarah, and how wrong he had been. The case is dismissed, Judge Harrison said quickly. Deputy Ambassador Mbeki, would you join me in my chambers? I believe we have some things to discuss. Sarah checked her watch. I'm afraid I don't have time right now. I have important meetings to attend, but my office will be in touch about scheduling a proper discussion about what happened here today. She gathered her papers and turned to leave. As she walked down the aisle, people moved aside respectfully. At the door, she turned back one last time. Oh, and Your Honor, she said. The light was yellow. With that, she left the courtroom. The reporters rushed out after her, and the room burst into conversation. Judge Harrison sat at his bench, looking at the diplomatic papers in his hands. In 30 years on the bench, he had never felt so ashamed. Officer Peterson quietly slipped out of the courtroom, knowing his report would need some serious revisions. And in the hallway, Sarah Mbeki walked toward the exit, her head held high, already thinking about how to turn this unfortunate incident into an opportunity for real change. By afternoon, the morning's events at the Boston courthouse were all over the local news. Judge Samuel Harrison sat in his office, staring at his computer screen as he read the headlines. Judge finds UN diplomat after racial profiling incident, and courthouse controversy. Deputy Ambassador exposes bias in justice system. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since Sarah Mbeki left the courtroom. The Chief Justice wanted an explanation. The mayor's office was worried about diplomatic relations. Even his wife had called after seeing the story on the local news. A knock on his door made him look up. His clerk, Jenny, stood there with more papers. Judge Harrison, the video from Officer Peterson's body camera just came in, she said quietly. Would you like to see it? The judge nodded, though he didn't really want to. He knew watching it would only make him feel worse. Jenny set up the video on his computer and left the room. The footage started playing. Judge Harrison watched as Officer Peterson pulled over Sarah's car. He could see clearly now what he hadn't wanted to see before. Sarah had been polite and professional the entire time. The light had indeed been yellow when she went through the intersection. As he watched, the judge remembered his own behavior in the courtroom. He had interrupted her, refused to look at her documents, and increased her fine simply because her confidence had annoyed him. Why had her calm dignity bothered him so much? Another knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. This time it was Robert Chen, a fellow judge he had known for 20 years. "Rough morning, Sam?" Robert asked, closing the door behind him. "You could say that," Judge Harrison replied, turning off the video. He couldn't watch anymore. "You know what the really scary part is?" Robert said, sitting down. "If she hadn't been a diplomat, nobody would be talking about this. It would have been just another day in court." Judge Harrison felt sick to his stomach because he knew Robert was right. How many other times had he made quick judgments based on how people looked or spoke? How many lives had he affected because of his own hidden biases? Just then, his phone rang again. It was from the Kenyan embassy. With a shaking hand, he picked up the receiver. "Judge Harrison speaking," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Judge Harrison, this is Thomas Amondi, Deputy Ambassador Mbiki's assistant," the voice said. "The ambassador would like to invite you to a meeting tomorrow morning at the embassy." The judge's throat felt dry. Yes, of course. "What time?" "9 a.m. And Judge." Thomas paused. "This isn't just about one traffic stop. The ambassador believes this incident could be a turning point for something bigger." After hanging up, Judge Harrison walked to his window. From his office, he could see people coming and going from the courthouse. He watched as they climbed the steps, carrying their hopes for justice with them. How many of them would get the fair treatment they deserved? His computer pinged with a new email. It was from a national news network, requesting an interview about the morning's events. They wanted to know his side of the story. But what could he say? That he had let his prejudices affect his judgment? That it took a diplomatic incident to make him see his own bias? As the afternoon sun started to set, Judge Harrison made a decision. He sat down at his computer and began typing. First, a formal letter of apology to Deputy Ambassador Mbeki. Then, a request to the Chief Justice for mandatory bias training for all court officials. Finally, a statement to the press, not defending his actions but acknowledging his mistake and promising to do better. Outside his office, the day's final cases were wrapping up. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new faces, new stories. But for the first time in 30 years, Judge Harrison knew he would see them differently. The diplomatic passport that had forced him to confront his bias had also given him a chance to change. He looked at the clock. In less than 24 hours, he would face Deputy Ambassador Mbeki again. This time he would listen, really listen. It was the least he could do. And maybe, just maybe, it would be the start of something important. The Kenyan embassy in Boston was a beautiful old building with tall windows and marble steps. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, Judge Samuel Harrison walked up those steps, his heart beating fast. He had barely slept the night before, thinking about what he would say to Deputy Ambassador Mbeki. Inside, the walls were decorated with colorful African art and photographs showing scenes from Kenya. Thomas Omondi, Sarah's assistant, met him in the lobby. Unlike yesterday's tense courtroom, Thomas greeted him with a warm smile. "Good morning, Judge Harrison," Thomas said. "Please, follow me. The Deputy Ambassador is waiting in the conference room." As they walked down the hallway, Judge Harrison noticed a group of reporters waiting outside the building. News of this meeting had spread quickly. He wondered what they expected to happen. The conference room was large and bright. Sarah Mbeki sat at a long table, looking through some papers. She wore a bright blue dress today, and her presence filled the room just as it had filled his courtroom yesterday. But this time, they were on her territory. "Judge Harrison," she said, standing to greet him. "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." The judge sat down, noticing that his hands were shaking slightly. On the table in front of them were newspapers from across the country. All of them had stories about what had happened in his courtroom. "I've read your apology letter," Sarah said, picking up a piece of paper. "It was well written, but I'm more interested in actions than words." "I understand," Judge Harrison replied. "I've already requested bias training for all court officials, and I'm willing to." Sarah held up her hand, just like she had done in court. "Before we discuss that, I'd like you to see something." She pressed a button on a remote control, and a screen lowered from the ceiling. A video started playing. It showed different people: Black, Hispanic, Asian, and others. talking about their experiences in courtrooms across America. Their stories were similar to what had happened to Sarah, but they didn't have diplomatic passports to protect them. Judge Harrison watched, feeling more uncomfortable with each story. When the video ended, the room was quiet for a long moment. "Those interviews were recorded just yesterday," Sarah explained. "After what happened in your courtroom, people started coming forward with their own stories. This isn't just about one judge or one traffic stop anymore." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the reporters below. "Do you know what makes me sad, Judge Harrison? Yesterday, you saw my diplomatic passport, and suddenly I became a person worth listening to. But what about all the others? Don't they deserve the same respect?" The judge felt tears in his eyes. "They do," he said quietly, "and I failed them. I've probably been failing them for years without even realizing it." Sarah turned back to him. "Then let's do something about it." She handed him a folder. Inside was a proposal for a new program, one that would track and review judicial decisions for signs of bias, provide regular training for court officials, and create a system for people to report unfair treatment. "The embassy is willing to help fund this program," Sarah said. "We can turn yesterday's incident into something positive. But it will take real commitment, not just apologies." Judge Harrison read through the proposal. It would mean big changes, and some people wouldn't like it. But as he thought about the video he had just watched, he knew it was necessary. "I'll support it," he said firmly. "And I'll speak to other judges about implementing it in their courts too." Sarah smiled for the first time since they'd met. "Good. The press is waiting outside. Shall we tell them together?" As they walked toward the door, Judge Harrison realized something. Yesterday's embarrassing incident could have ended with just an apology. Instead, it was becoming the start of real change. Sometimes, he thought, our biggest mistakes can lead to our most important opportunities. Outside, the cameras were ready, and the reporters waited with their questions. But this time, Judge Harrison wasn't afraid. He had a different story to tell, not about a mistake, but about what happens when we have the courage to learn from our mistakes and do better. That evening, after the press conference at the embassy, Judge Harrison sat alone in his home office. The TV was on mute, showing clips from his public appearance with Deputy Ambassador Mbeki. His phone kept buzzing with messages from other judges across the country, but he wasn't ready to read them yet. His wife Susan brought him a cup of coffee and sat down nearby. She had been watching him all evening, worried about how quiet he seemed. "You're doing the right thing, Sam," she said softly. The judge picked up an old photo album from his shelf. Inside were pictures from his 30 years on the bench. Hundreds of faces looked back at him, people whose lives he had affected with his decisions. How many of those decisions had been influenced by his hidden biases? "I keep thinking about this case from last month," he told Susan, "a young black man charged with disturbing the peace. I gave him the maximum fine without really listening to his side." He closed his eyes. "I wouldn't have done that to a white college student." Susan reached out and touched his hand. "You can't change the past, Sam, but you can change what happens next." Judge Harrison opened his laptop and started searching through his old case files. He had been on the bench for so long that patterns were easy to find. The numbers told a clear story. Minorities consistently received harsher sentences in his courtroom. His coffee got cold as he worked through the night. He made lists of cases to review, decisions that might need another look. Around midnight, he found himself writing personal notes about things he had never noticed before. Why did I always believe police officers without question? How many times did I interrupt people of color in my courtroom? When did I start assuming guilt based on appearance? The next morning, he arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. As he walked to his office, he noticed things he had never paid attention to before. The security guards stopped more people of color for extra checks. The court clerk spoke more curtly to non-white visitors. It was like seeing his courthouse with new eyes. In his office, he found a surprise waiting on his desk. It was a letter from Officer Peterson, the policeman from the traffic stop. "Judge Harrison," the letter began, "after what happened with Deputy Ambassador Mbeki, I've been doing my own thinking. I reviewed my traffic stops for the past year. The patterns I found disturbed me. Maybe it's time for change in the police department, too." The judge picked up his phone and called the police chief. They talked for an hour about creating a joint program between the courts and the police department to address bias. The chief was hesitant at first, When Judge Harrison shared his own journey of self-discovery, things changed. "We can't hide from this anymore," the judge said. "We need to face it together." By lunchtime, word had spread through the courthouse about the changes coming. Some people were nervous. Others were relieved that someone was finally talking about these issues openly. A young black clerk stopped by his office. "Thank you, Judge Harrison," she said quietly. "I've worked here for 5 years, and this is the first time I feel like someone sees the problems we face." In the afternoon, he had his first meeting with the court's new bias review committee. The room was filled with people from different backgrounds: judges, lawyers, community leaders, and regular citizens. They all had stories to share and ideas for making things better. As Judge Harrison listened to their experiences, he remembered something Deputy Ambassador Mbeki had said at the embassy. "Change doesn't happen in big moments. It happens in small decisions, every day, when we choose to do better." Looking around the room at all these people working together for change, he finally felt something he hadn't expected: hope. The incident with Sarah Mbeki had been embarrassing and painful, but it had cracked open a door that needed opening. That evening, as he left the courthouse, he saw a young family climbing the steps, a black mother with 2 small children. They looked nervous, like many people do when they come to court. Judge Harrison smiled at them warmly. "Welcome to your courthouse," he said, and he meant it. For the first time in 30 years, he truly meant it. 1 week after the traffic court incident, Deputy Ambassador Sarah Mbeki sat in her office at the Kenyan embassy, reviewing reports about the changes happening in Boston's judicial system. Local newspapers had given the story national attention, and other cities were starting to look at their own courts with new eyes. Her assistant Thomas knocked on her door. "Deputy Ambassador, Judge Harrison is here for your meeting." Sarah looked up from her papers and nodded. This wasn't their first meeting since the courthouse incident, but it was different. Today wasn't about programs or policies. Today was personal. Judge Harrison walked in, carrying a thick folder under his arm. He looked different from the angry man who had fined her in court. His face was softer, more humble. "Please sit down, Judge Harrison," Sarah said, gesturing to a chair. "Would you like some Kenyan tea?" "Yes, thank you," he replied, his voice quiet. As Thomas poured the tea, the judge opened his folder. "I've spent the past week reviewing cases from my court," he began. "Not just recent ones, but going back years. What I found—" his voice broke a little. "What I found makes me ashamed." Sarah sipped her tea, waiting for him to continue. Through the window behind her desk, the sounds of Boston traffic drifted up from the street below. "I found patterns of bias in my decisions," Judge Harrison continued. "Different fines for the same crimes, harsher sentences for minorities. Times when I didn't even let people finish explaining their side." He looked directly at Sarah. "Just like I did with you." Sarah put down her teacup. "And what do you plan to do about these findings?" The judge pulled out several papers from his folder. "First, I've asked the court to review all these cases. Where we find unfair decisions, we'll work to make them right." He handed her the papers. "Second, I want to tell my story. The whole story. Not just about what happened with you, but about the biases I carried for 30 years without seeing them." Sarah read through the papers. They detailed plans for case reviews, community meetings, and public discussions about bias in the justice system. It was more than she had expected. "You understand this might end your career?" she asked. "Not everyone will support this kind of honesty." Judge Harrison nodded. "I know, but I've spent 30 years being part of the problem. I want to spend whatever time I have left being part of the solution." Sarah stood up and walked to a wall covered with photographs. One showed her as a young law student in Kenya, standing proud in her graduation gown. Another showed her father, who had been a judge in Nairobi for 40 years. "My father used to say that true justice doesn't see color, but the people giving justice must see their own biases first," she said. "It takes courage to look at yourself honestly, Judge Harrison." She turned back to him. "Your apology today isn't just about what happened in your courtroom last week. It's about 30 years of decisions that affected real people's lives." "Yes," the judge agreed. "And I know saying sorry isn't enough, but it's where I need to start." Sarah walked back to her desk and pressed a button on her phone. "Thomas, please ask the camera crew to come in." Judge Harrison looked surprised. "Camera crew?" "Yes," Sarah explained. If you're serious about telling your story, let's tell it properly. The embassy's media team will record your statement. We'll share it with other courts, law schools, and judicial training programs. The judge straightened his tie, looking nervous. What should I say? Sarah smiled gently. Just tell the truth. Start with what happened in your courtroom last week, but don't stop there. Talk about what you've learned, what you've found in your case reviews, and what needs to change. As the camera crew set up their equipment, Sarah watched Judge Harrison prepare himself. She thought about all the people who would hear his story: other judges, police officers, court officials, and ordinary citizens. Maybe his honesty would help them see their own biases too. Are you ready? She asked him. Judge Harrison took a deep breath and nodded. He was ready to tell this story, not for himself, but for all the people who deserved better from their justice system. 6 months had passed since the day Sarah Mbeki walked into Judge Harrison's courtroom. Boston had changed during that time, so had its justice system. On a bright spring morning, Sarah stood at a podium in front of the courthouse. A large crowd had gathered to witness the opening of the new Judicial Fairness Center. Reporters from across the country pointed their cameras at her as she began to speak. 6 months ago, I stood in this courthouse as a victim of bias, she said, her voice clear and strong. Today, I stand here as a partner in change. This center will train judges, review court decisions, and make sure everyone gets fair treatment in our courts. Judge Harrison sat behind her on the stage, along with other officials. He looked different now, more relaxed, more human. His hair had gotten a little grayer, but his eyes were brighter. The past 6 months hadn't been easy for him, but he hadn't given up. His video confession, recorded at the embassy, had gone viral. Millions of people had watched him talk about his biases and mistakes. Some judges had criticized him for speaking out. Others had been inspired to look at their own behavior. Thanks to Judge Harrison's honesty, Sarah continued, over 500 old cases have been reviewed. Many unfair decisions have been corrected. But more importantly, new cases are being handled differently. She pointed to the changes everyone could see. The courthouse now had signs in multiple languages. The staff looked more diverse. Even the security guards had received special training in treating everyone with respect. Officer Peterson, who had given Sarah the traffic ticket that started everything, was there too. He had become one of the leaders in police reform, teaching other officers about recognizing their own biases. After the speeches, Sarah walked through the new Judicial Fairness Center. The walls displayed photographs showing the history of civil rights in America. One section was dedicated to stories of people who had faced unfair treatment in courts. Their stories were being heard at last. In one room, a training session was happening. Judges from different courts watched body camera videos and discussed how bias could affect their decisions. They weren't just talking about race anymore, but about all kinds of prejudice against poor people, immigrants, people who spoke different languages. Judge Harrison joined Sarah as she looked around. Sometimes I still can't believe all this started with a traffic ticket, he said. Sarah smiled. It didn't start with a traffic ticket. It started when one person finally admitted they needed to change. That's always where real change begins. They walked to his old courtroom, which looked different now. The judge's bench had been lowered so it wasn't so high above everyone else. There were translators ready to help people who didn't speak English well. The whole room felt more welcoming. I'm retiring next month, Judge Harrison told her. But before I go, I want to make sure this work continues. It will, Sarah assured him. What happened here in Boston is spreading. 10 other cities have started similar programs. The Supreme Court is looking at making bias training mandatory for all federal judges. Outside, the spring sun was warm on their faces. New flowers had been planted along the courthouse steps, making the building look less scary and official. People walking in and out smiled more often now. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. The trade agreements she had come to Boston to negotiate 6 months ago were finally ready to be signed. But somehow, those didn't seem as important as what had happened here. You know, she said to Judge Harrison, my father always told me that one person can change the world. I never really believed him until now. The judge looked at her thoughtfully. One person didn't change this world, he said. We did it together. You, me, Officer Peterson, all those people who shared their stories. That's how real change works. As they watched, a young black woman walked up the courthouse steps, holding her head high. She didn't look afraid or nervous. She looked like she belonged there. And that, Sarah thought, was the biggest change of all.